Well, my worst fears have been realized. When we were first talking about this program, I thought that being sandwiched in between Andy, who should have his own TV show, and Nancy, who should have her own TV show, that the financial aspect of some of this would end up being extremely boring. So if the bar is set at extremely boring, I'm hoping to exceed your expectations. And if you pick up the handout that says Art Trends in a Changing Super Trend World, go in a couple of pages, the factors driving fine art demand. Well, obviously supply and demand is one of the key factors. And the issue in the art world, of course, is that what is fine art? Well, there's so many different gradations of fine art. And some of the things that Nancy's going to be talking about, and some of the things that Andy already talked about, there's so many different levels of what would be considered fine art. And so the wealth effect definitely drives the price of some of the higher end things, things you hear about from Christie's or Sotheby's or some of the overseas collectors who are paying fabulous prices for things. But for most of us in this room, I think it's really the fine art that's affordable, that's at a reasonable price. Those are the ones that we're kind of thinking to ourselves, well, if I really like it, but maybe I'll put off buying it for a certain period of time. And this wealth effect is the concept of how wealthy you perceive yourself to be. And everybody's got a different idea of that. Some of our clients in the San Francisco Bay Area have a much higher bar for what has to be wealthy there than, for example, Greensboro or some other places. And so, one of the things that certainly the Great Recession has done is dampen the enthusiasm of the wealth effect. Demographics. Interestingly, we're going to talk a little bit about the increasing wealth of women, and there are 5 demographic groups within the United States that are actually driving half of all consumer purchases. And it sort of gets lost in all the very difficult recovery from the recession that these 5 demographic groups have pretty significant discretionary income and are driving a very large percentage of the fine art purchases and the pricing in the middle to upper end of the fine art market. And then finally, the super trend, something that our firm has done a lot of research on over the years, and how some of these super trends may affect the art industry in general. Again, up and down that line from affordably priced to absolutely unaffordable for most of us. Let's put it that way. All right, so let's turn to the next page. And this is a very recent Barclays survey that said that only 10% of people actually in the wealthier categories buy art as an investment. And 69% buy art to enhance their quality of life and bring increased happiness. I would suspect that if they look down into, and having known Lenny for a long time, look down into a lot of the people who buy art from the art shop, the numbers probably 99.9% are in that last category, to enhance their life. We had a very interesting conversation before the event began, just talking about some specialty pieces that these folks have bought, and how beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And each of us, if we had a piece up here, it would be kind of interesting. I don't know, maybe that could be a future program or a reality TV show of how 50 people would view the value of a particular piece. And my guess is it would be all over the place. If you had 10 different pieces, each of you would, I doubt, even if you hit the same number of value, it would probably be a complete accident that you did. Again, it's that perception of art as value. Now, if you turn to the next page, again on this wealth effect, this is the net worth of households and nonprofit institutions in the United States. And what you see is, of course, that very significant drop that we had with the recession, and then the recovery. But you can see that recovery is not back to where it was. Now, stock market is getting back to where it was. But what piece of this chart represents the largest chunk of why we're not back to where we were? Anybody got an idea?
Housing.
Housing, exactly. And fine art, although there's a lot of corporate collections, and we actually have several of Lenny's pieces in our own company, housing is where a lot of people put their art, in their homes. And so some of the art trends and the financials around art have certainly been driven by the fact that people don't feel their home is that big store of value that maybe it once was. And so that has had a tremendous effect. Again, different areas of the market, a few of the ones that Nancy's going to talk about, probably towards the upper end, maybe not quite as much because of the fact that there's still some fabulously wealthy collectors around the world who are, even with this, still fabulously wealthy. But for the average art collector, it has dampened the what they call animal spirits a little bit. Well, what other wealth effects are there? Well, there's the stock market. Now, this chart here, kind of looking out the front windshield instead of the rearview mirror on what has happened with the recession, this particular series of numbers shows what you could expect the returns to be in bonds and stocks based upon different criteria going out 5 years from now. And so on the right-hand side, again, a large predictor of how the art demand will be in terms of the wealth chasing after art is the stock market. And whenever you've had a price-earnings ratio below 14, that's how much you pay for a stock per dollar of earnings, below 14, the return in the stock market has been 10.8% a year, real return over inflation for the next 5 years. Now, right now, who would expect, who would have any anticipation that that could even be possible? Well, that happens to be where we are in valuation, even after this big run-up that we've had recently. So looking out the front windshield, I think there's a reasonable expectation. I can't tell you what's going to happen, exactly what the political environment and the fiscal cliff and, the next 6 months to a year. But over the next 5 years, reasonable expectation that we're going to be seeing some recovery in the stock market. We're going to be seeing it to levels that some of us may not even think can happen. And that we may also see that in the housing market. When you analyze the housing stats around the country, things are firming up in a lot of different areas. Now, there's a few areas where they haven't cleared out a lot of the foreclosures, and there's still not that net positive population growth or net positive job creation. Those areas are going to stay squishy for a while. But a lot of housing areas are really starting to show some signs of not racing off the bottom, but getting off the bottom. And so those two factors, housing and stocks, chances are if we're in this room 5 years from now, a lot of these pieces and a lot of the fine art is going to be more expensive. There will be more people feeling the wealth effect and feeling the ability to afford more fine art and aesthetic things around it, beyond art. And so, page 7, uncertainty creates opportunity. This is one of the hallmarks of virtually everything in history. You can go back to the South Sea stock bubble back in the 1700s. You can look at almost any time in history, and we as humans, we like to think we're very civilized, but there are some things that we have still kind of succumbed to the fear and greed cycles. And so what tends to happen is in times of greatest uncertainty, we tend to get a little more conservative. And it's a natural tendency. I mean, again, think back 10,000 years ago. If you had just had one of your neighbors eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, you might not venture quite as far from the cave the next day. You might decide, you know, this is a good day to chisel a book on the wall, or maybe a piece of art on the wall. And acid-free, of course. And so, you know, again, very natural human behavior tendencies. And a lot of the things that we have studied in our shop around behavioral finance suggest that the greatest opportunities come when the uncertainty is the highest. When everything's certain and all the flags are flying green and it seems like everything's great, that's the time to be nervous that, you know, some shoe may be out there getting ready to drop. Okay, go to the next page. Again, a trend that is driving art in a lot of markets is the increasing wealth and independent. A Family Wealth Advisors Council study from last year, and a couple of folks in our shop are in this nationwide study group that was part of this study. And women control 83% of consumer spending. 40% of families have women as their primary breadwinner. That was a bit of a surprising statistic. 95% of women will control their family's finances at some point in their lives. And that tends to be because we males don't live quite as long. And on average, women outlive their spouses by 14 years. Now, the interesting thing about this particular trend is, again, because of some of the demographics that are going on, the baby boomers kind of hurtling towards retirement, you're seeing this effect becoming more and more pronounced. And again, if you're looking out the front windshield instead of the rearview mirror, the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see this particular impact in the art market and a whole variety of other markets become more and more significant. Okay, now, the next page, getting down to some very mundane pieces, is how much should I spend on art? And again, because of a lot of the factors that I've mentioned, it is very likely that discretionary spending is going to be on the rise, and particularly in these 5 key demographic groups that I'm going to describe in a second, despite a lot of pretty difficult lingering effects of the Great Recession. So what we have found, we have a number of clients around the country who would really consider themselves art collectors. Now, they're not up in the $1 million range, but they're, they'll do some fairly significant purchases from time to time. And they kind of allocate towards the high end of this 3 to 7% range. We actually have one client over in the Triangle who, there's a kind of a rule of thumb in financial planning that if you can save 10% a year, that's a really good thing. Well, from his viewpoint, putting 10% into fine art every year is a form of saving for his soul. And that's literally the way he puts it. And so the 3 to 7%, completely arbitrary. Again, everybody kind of has a different view of fine art in their life. The 3%, that's probably more the folks who are just slowly kind of, building a collection, want to have things around them that again, are good for them. Other people, it may not be their cup of tea, but it's something that really has triggered their imagination. So you go to this next page, page 10, and again, this is the very surprising piece, that 10% of Americans drive 50% of consumer spending, which is 1/3 of the entire U.S. economy. And it's these 5 demographic groups at the bottom, and they purchase over 98% of the fine art in the United States. So it's the greatest generation. And who wrote the book on the greatest generation? Anybody know?
Tom Brokaw.
Tom Brokaw, thank you. The 1901 to 1924 folks. The silent generation, which are the generation right after them. The higher income baby boomers, which, there's a perception that the baby boomers are driving a lot of things in our economy, which is true to some extent, but there's 4 different categories of baby boomers. a couple of the categories of baby boomers really don't have much discretionary income. They're not, I mean, they're struggling just to get to retirement, much less looking at fine art. But there are a higher income segment of baby boomers that are pretty significant. The wealthy, and again, this is usually the older baby boomers, those are the ones in the late 50s, early 60s. And then there is a surprising 30 to 40-year-old Gen X professional and manager group that have pretty significant income. Now, they don't have huge net worth buildup yet, but in our country, this segment is way bigger than most people think it is. And again, in the art area, they are beginning to drive some purchases. Now, we don't really have time to get down to, okay, in these 5 different areas, which types of art do they like the most? But I will tell you, I sat through a presentation by someone from Sotheby's talking about that, and it was fascinating because it was maybe not what you would think. You would sort of think, well, maybe the older generations like some of the older pieces, and maybe the younger generations like more contemporary. Well, there's certainly some of that going on, but it was interesting that some of the older baby boomers really like to have art in a lot of different, again, the conversation we were having, in a lot of different styles, and some more contemporary and some more traditional. And again, it gets back to, you know, art, the value of art is in the eye of the beholder. Okay, so if you turn to the next page, American spending patterns. Now, there's probably a lot of interesting discussions that have nothing to do with art on this page. But what you're seeing here is the spending pattern. Oh, and I think we lost part of the top of the header. So let me decipher what you're looking at. The far right-hand side is actually the spending patterns of Americans today. Okay, the far right bar. And then the kind of bar right next to it, this is the spending patterns from roughly 40 years ago. Okay? So, first thing that kind of catches your eye is we're spending a lot more on food back then. We're spending a lot more on housing today.
This was 40
Now,
years ago.
and again, some of this is the expansion of houses. If you think about in the 50s and 60s and 70s, what people thought was enough for a home in terms of the size of the home, it was much smaller, and then you had the home inflation of square footage. And so that's part of that big number in that far right blue bar. But the other piece that's in there is really the piece of what do you put in the house. Now, there are some other categories which you see broken out on the left, all those little bubbles. And so the blue area, you see the rent and mortgages, the upper left, and then you have furniture and other household items, 4.1%. Well, that's where fine art often gets lumped in. And then utilities, 5.4%. But again, our experience with a lot of our clients is sometimes if they like a piece, they'll say, well, it's up here, but I actually have it down in my discretionary other category, the orange area. And, you know, maybe I won't eat out as often because I really want to pick up this particular piece. So, again, art is one of those things that is kind of interesting in terms of what people will do to surround themselves with aesthetic beauty. Okay, if you go to the next page, I talked earlier about some of the super trends, and again, not really the function tonight to get into a lot of depth on these, but there are 8 different growth areas that from the year 2012 now to 2020, the next 8 years, are expected to grow by $1 trillion or more over that period of time. Now, this is another one of those things that's a little hard to get your head around, $1 trillion. You know, we throw around the numbers. Well, if you look on the very bottom, you see that the global economy right now is $60 trillion a year. We represent about 25% of it, the United States. Okay? So all of these 8 different areas represent a total potential impact, positive impact on world growth of between 26 to 43 trillion dollars, not per year, in aggregate. We would wish it was up per year, but this is in aggregate over the next 8 years. But still, you divide that by 8 and you look at where we are now, and again, I think there is some reason to believe that we may see some more positive demand factors for a lot of fine art over this next 8 years because of some of the trends I mentioned before, and because some of these things are going to help that wealth effect. Well, there's a subtext to this as well. The subtext is that a few of the items on this list, particularly number 7, soft innovations. Soft innovations, the easiest way to think of that is over the last 10 years, we have had a significant rise in the poundage of coffee being sold. But then if you look at the total revenues from coffee being sold, it's a line that goes almost straight up, much higher than the actual poundage of coffee. So what would cause that?
Starbucks.
Starbucks, right. And now McCafe and everybody else selling essentially the same coffee. And my wife would argue with that. But, essentially the same coffee, but at a higher price point. Well, the interesting thing is in the soft innovations area, it's happening everywhere, and we don't really see it or feel it. You know, Andy made the comment that it's just like fine art can deteriorate, and it happens in slow little increments. Think about all the things we have today that we didn't have 10 years ago or 20 years ago that we kind of take for granted. You know, maybe it's the iPad or the iPhone or other sorts of things. Well, this particular area of soft innovation, the number one thing that CEOs of companies who are doing soft innovation want their employees to be is creative and innovative. And the majority of those leaders want their employees to be surrounded by things that are aesthetically pleasing and positive to make them more creative and innovative. So you put those little equations together and you say, that might actually be a potential driver of art demand. And voila, it turns out it is. So you go to the next page, and the majority of what are called gazelles, gazelles are essentially a company. Now it can be small, middle-sized, public company that is growing much faster than the normal average. If you look at the Inc. 500 list of 500 fastest growing private businesses in the country, that list is filled with companies growing at 20% or more per year. And those are the gazelles. They're creating massive job growth. But you also see some middle-sized and larger companies, same thing. Well, those companies and their CEOs are driving the fine art market and will probably, over the next 5 to 10 years, drive it even more. In fact, the estimated demand out of this area for art is going to be at least a 3 times multiple, maybe even size of 5 times multiple of money that is buying fine art. Okay, so investment do's and don'ts. We had several conversations before this presentation began, and the thing that I heard over and over again was invest in what you like. And that is absolutely true, because if you buy something you like, regardless of whether, you know, times are tough or times are better, it's going to provide that regular psychic income to you, a psychic dividend. And you know what? They cannot tax that psychic dividend. Yeah. Oh, you stole my punchline. Okay. Number 2, invest in quality. Many of you have heard life is too short to buy cheap wine or cheap art. And again, we have one shot through this thing called life, and so it's good to surround ourselves with high quality things. And then this good environment equals enhanced right brain creativity. If you want to see some really interesting stuff, look at what Daniel Pink has done. He's written a number of books on right brain creativity. He actually believes that this next decade, the next 10 years, are going to belong to the right brain thinkers. which again is a contrarian thought right now, because the thought is that it's the left brain thinkers, the scientists, the engineers, those are the folks that are in very short supply today, high demand, that are going to own this next 10 years. His contention, and then a number of others, is that things like the iPhone and the iPad that you don't need to be a genius to figure out how to run, those things are going to unleash the right brain creativity. Well, the right brainers, I can tell you from some of our work with folks around the country, clients, is they love to buy fine art in copious amounts. So again, I think a very interesting potential driver of art trends. And so, the question is, does your fine art inspire you or provide food for the soul? Going back to something Andy said, are your favorite art pieces positioned so you see them every day? We had one client who had kind of put one of their favorite pieces because of the new place they had moved into, downsized, and it just wasn't in a place where they could even enjoy it, the light and everything else. And so, again, if you're going to have great stuff, it ought to be in places that you can see it and enjoy it. Okay. Hopefully I exceeded the extremely boring low bar. But before Nancy comes on, happy to answer any questions. Yes?
I used to manage an art gallery in San Francisco. We've had a lot of corporations back in the mid-70s to 80s, including Rockstar, Bechtel. All these people were buying huge amount of arts, investing for their corporations, hung them in their lobbies, their various locations. How would you say corporations buying art have changed today?
Yeah, now that's a very good question, because we actually have a client who is in that particular arena. And I would say it's changed pretty dramatically, because the corporations, things are more transparent today, and they are, many of the public companies, now private companies, different story, but, and Rockstar maybe a different story, I don't know.
They have some great collections.
Yeah, I guess they have e-television or something photographing from time to time, so people will actually see what they're doing. But the public corporations, there is so much transparency now. And that's not to say that, we know everything that goes on, but there's so much more of a bright white light that has been shown into a lot of these companies. And many of those companies want to be perceived as good stewards for the shareholders, and it's a little more difficult for them to sometimes connect the dots of fine art to the creativity of their employees. And as you may know, a lot of major corporations have been hoarding cash for the last 5 years after the recession. Now there's some expectation that maybe they'll loosen those purse strings up more next year, regardless of who wins the presidency. But I'm not sure they're going to do it in the art area. Now there are some CEOs out there, and I have one on here that is a great example, Steve Jobs, who pretty much wouldn't care. Yeah, if he got criticism, he would say, that's a good thing, because it shows that I'm, kind of marching to a different drummer and have a different idea. Not everybody can be a Steve Jobs.
So what happened to those art collections that those corporations were collecting from the mid-70s through the 80s, even into the 90s? Because they're not hanging in Bank of America buildings much anymore. I mean, the ones that, the art market has changed, the artists have changed, tastes have changed, and I wondered what has happened to those collections. Are they going at Sotheby's? Are they just in a vault waiting to increase in value or demand? What's happening?
Well, I think, again, you have to look at all the different gradations of the fine art market. So at the upper end, my suspicion is that they got parsed out different places now. We are aware of at least one major Fortune 100 company that has a bunch of probably very valuable art just kind of sitting in a back room, which again might not be the best. Maybe we need to have you go in there, Andy, and help consult on that particular.
I have appraised, like I was at Lincoln Financial, and they have a whole room full of art and different things that were purchased over this year that was purchased, and it's all in a room right now, stacked up. And some of it's really good, but they've taken it down over the years, removed it, and it's just sitting there. It's literally sitting in a room waiting for somebody to decide what to do with it.
Okay, so you don't know what they're gonna probably do with that.
A lot of times people get to, you know, I had one client that had it ended up being an Edward Hopper, and it was worth $7 million. And it sat behind his desk for like 20 years, and they finally took it down. It was a woman sitting on a train, and it turned out it sold at auction for over $7 million. So there are some incredible pieces out there. It's just people don't always know, you know, what they have.
Sure.
So there's some good pieces.
Well, we were talking earlier about was it Burlington Industries that here locally that had I guess it was an auction of all their art pieces, and that some of the pieces just sort of got scattered around, and someone donated one of them to Goodwill recently. Yeah, because they couldn't find a buyer for it and some of that. Yeah.
My question is kind of related to what you've been talking about. Throughout history, artists have been supported by patrons. Just came across a situation recently where a local artist in North Carolina has been commissioned to do all the artwork for a company, which is going to take him years to do. Plus, he can still do his own thing on the side. Have you seen any of that either with companies or individuals where they're actually becoming patrons to a particular artist or school of artwork and kind of supporting them to some extent?
Well, and I'll give you my perspective, and then Nancy or Andy or Lenny may have some other thoughts on that. We are seeing that more, and I guess this was true back in the Renaissance and many other times, that it was the more wealthy segments of society that ended up being the patrons. And that seems to be kind of the effect today, but I don't know if, someone at a lower end, if somebody just, providing free space for them. I guess we do know of a couple of those situations here in Greensboro, but do you have any perspective?
Well, as one local example, the Quaintance Weaver hired a local artist whose name I'm blanking out on. Chris, begins with C, something like that. To do all of the paintings in their guest rooms at the proximity. So that's an example of kind of local patronage. But I would say one of the biggest modes of patronage now are collectors, in that they're collectors who collect in depth a single artist's work and effectively end up supporting those artists, or partially, anyway. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just quick
Or
note.
comments?
It's interesting to look at how art has cross-pollinated with other industries. For instance, the wine industry and wine labels and art.
Yeah.
That's just an idea, but I'm wondering what happens to those originals that were created, that are either on the label, if they're created just for the label, or if they're famous artists that have been used, Dolly, numerous, and the Rothschilds and whatnot. It is interesting how it's brought an awareness of fine art through a whole different medium than a gallery or an exhibit or a collector, and yet now we have wine collectors, and they're not only collecting the incredible rare bottles of wine, but they're now collecting the bottles for the labels, and the labels have become art forms in their own right, and have won design awards, for instance, Frog's Leap. So can you speak to that, to the cross-pollination of industries that are using art to promote both the art and their business? Virgin Airlines would be a good idea.
Yeah, Virgin Airlines. Again, the soft innovation of the $8 trillion themes, they all have interesting dynamics around this topic, but we don't have time to get too in depth with any of them. But the soft innovations piece that I talked about, and the unleashing human creativity and productivity piece that kind of gets lost on that list, but there are some people like Daniel Pink who think that is the biggest trend of those 8 areas. Those all suggest that we're coming into a time when there will be much more convergence of, art and wine and different kinds of things. And again, the unleashing of human creativity. Andy sort of talked the history lesson of what was done 100 years ago, people didn't really understand or didn't know. Well, now there's a lot of knowledge out there, and it's beginning to show up in the form of good, solid products like those wine bottles that you can collect that have nice art on them. I mean, my wife and I, we have friends who own a winery up in Virginia, and she says, the wine's pretty good, but the art on the bottles is better. Now, we're not actually collecting those, to my knowledge. But going back to the women's trend, maybe I need to
She
find
might
out.
have a secret stash in her.
That's right.
Okay, well, this is a good opportunity for me to bring up Nancy